What happens when science reaches its limits and faith becomes the only answer? Today, you'll witness a story that defied every medical protocol, challenged the beliefs of a renowned surgeon, and proved that miracles still happen in the most unexpected ways. This is about a moment when heaven literally appeared on earth. Before we continue, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I really want to see how far the power of these stories is reaching. The rain hammered against the windows of St. Catherine's Hospital that October night as Dr. Marcus Chin scrubbed his hands for what felt like the 100th time. His fingers moved mechanically over soap, the familiar ritual doing nothing to calm the storm in his chest. In 30 years of pediatric surgery, he had saved countless children, had been called a miracle worker by grateful parents, had lectures named after him at prestigious medical schools. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was about to fail a 7-year-old girl named Sophia Martinez, and there was nothing his expertise could do about it. Sophia had been brought in 3 hours earlier after a devastating car accident. Her mother, Elena, sat in the waiting room, rosary beads clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles had turned white. The woman hadn't stopped praying since they'd wheeled Sophia into surgery. Marcus had wanted to tell her to save her prayers, that what her daughter needed was science, not superstition. But looking at the scans, even he had to admit that science was failing them tonight. The tumor they discovered during the emergency surgery was unlike anything Marcus had seen. It had wrapped itself around Sophia's heart like a malignant vine, its tendrils reaching into places no scalpel could safely go. The accident had caused internal bleeding that made the situation critical. Every attempt to remove the growth risked rupturing major vessels. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Williams, kept shooting him worried glances over his mask. They both knew the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. This child had maybe an hour, 2 at most. Marcus remembered the first time he'd lost a patient. He'd been a resident, cocky and sure that his skill could overcome any challenge. The boy had been 8, just a year older than Sophia. Marcus had promised the parents he would save their son, had looked them in the eyes with the arrogance of youth, and sworn it would be okay. When the boy died on his table, something in Marcus had broken and reformed harder, like a bone that heals stronger after fracture. He stopped making promises. He stopped believing in anything beyond what his hands could accomplish. His nurse, Patricia, had worked with him for 15 years. She knew his moods, his methods, his stubborn refusal to give up even when cases seemed hopeless. But tonight, she saw something different in his eyes. Defeat. Raw, crushing defeat. Dr. Chun, she said softly, the mother is asking for an update. Marcus pulled off his surgical cap and ran his hand through his graying hair. How did you tell a mother that her child was dying? How did you explain that all your knowledge, all your experience, all the advanced equipment surrounding them meant nothing against the cruel reality of an inoperable tumor? He'd done it before too many times, but it never got easier. Each time chipped away another piece of his soul. Walking to the waiting room felt like walking to his own execution. Elena Martinez looked up the moment he appeared, hope and terror warring in her dark eyes. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of face that suggested she'd known more hardship than her years should have allowed. Her husband had died in Afghanistan 2 years ago. Marcus knew from intake forms. Sophia was all she had left. Please, Elena whispered before he could speak. Please tell me she's okay. Marcus sat down beside her, abandoning the professional distance he usually maintained. Mrs. Martinez, Sophia's condition is critical. The tumor we found, it's a location that makes surgical removal extremely dangerous. We're doing everything we can, but I need you to understand that the situation is very serious. Elena's hand found his, gripping with desperate strength. You don't understand, doctor. She's special. God has plans for her. I know it. I've known it since the day she was born. She came 2 months early. The doctor said she wouldn't survive the night, but I prayed to the Virgin Mary and my baby lived. She's going to live now too. I know it. Marcus gently extracted his hand. He'd heard variations of this speech countless times. Parents always thought their children were special, chosen, protected by some higher power. He'd learned long ago not to argue with faith in moments like these. It was often all people had left. We're monitoring her constantly. If there's any change, I'll let you know immediately. Back in the OR, the situation had worsened. Sophia's blood pressure was dropping despite their best efforts. The monitors sang their electronic dirge, each beat marking another step toward the inevitable. Marcus stood over the small form on the table, her chest open, her heart visible and struggling. The tumor pulsed with each beat, a parasite stealing life with every second. We could try the experimental procedure from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Williams suggested without conviction. They both knew it had only worked twice in recorded history, and never on a tumor this advanced. Marcus was about to respond when something strange happened. The lights in the OR flickered, not unusual in itself. The hospital's electrical system was old and temperamental, but then the main monitor, the one displaying Sophia's vital signs, began to show interference. Static lines ran across the screen like tears in reality itself. "Get maintenance," Marcus barked, but Patricia was already reaching for the phone when she froze. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice strange. "Look at the monitor." The static had formed a pattern. It was subtle at first, just suggestions of shapes in electronic snow. But then it became clearer, more defined. A figure seemed to be emerging from the interference, a woman's silhouette that shouldn't have been possible on medical equipment. She wore flowing robes, her head covered, her hands extended in a gesture of blessing. Everyone in the room stood transfixed. "It's a malfunction," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The image was too clear, too deliberate to be random interference. And then, impossible as it seemed, the figure appeared to turn toward him. Though it had no distinguishable features in static, Marcus felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in decades. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Several team members later swore they smelled roses, though there were no flowers allowed in the OR. The figure on the monitor raised one hand, and the static formed words that shouldn't have been possible on that equipment. "Have faith. Guide your hands. I am here." Marcus felt something crack inside him. 30 years of skepticism warring with what his eyes were seeing. His hands began to move without conscious thought, returning Sophia's open chest. The tumor that had seemed impossible to remove suddenly appeared different, as if he was seeing it from a new angle. There, a plane of separation he hadn't noticed before. Here, a way to reach the attachment point without risking the major vessels. "Scalpel," he heard himself say, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Patricia handed him the instrument, her eyes wide behind her surgical mask. What happened next defied every principle of medical science Marcus had ever learned. His hands moved with precision that felt guided by something beyond his own skill. The tumor began to separate from the heart tissue cleanly, impossibly cleanly. Where there should have been massive bleeding, there was barely a drop. Where the growth had seemed inextricably entwined with vital structures, it now peeled away like it had never truly been attached. The room was silent, except for the steady beep of the monitors. No one dared speak, afraid that acknowledging what was happening might break whatever spell had fallen over the OR. Even Dr. Williams, who'd been an atheist longer than Marcus, stood transfixed as the impossible unfolded before them. 20 minutes later, Marcus lifted the entire tumor free. It came out in one piece, something that should have been surgically impossible given its size and location. As he placed it in the specimen tray, the monitors began to sing a different song. Sophia's vitals were stabilizing. Her blood pressure rose steadily. Her heart, freed from its burden, began to beat with renewed strength. The figure on the monitor slowly faded, the static resolving back into normal vital sign readings. But everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something beyond explanation. Patricia was crying behind her mask. Dr. Williams kept removing and replacing his glasses, as if trying to clear his vision. Marcus stood with the tumor in the tray before him, his hands trembling for the first time in his surgical career. They closed Sophia's chest in reverent silence. Every suture was placed with extraordinary care, as if they were sealing something sacred. When they finally wheeled her to recovery, her color had already improved dramatically. The gray pallor of death had been replaced by the pink flush of returning life. Marcus found Elena still in the waiting room, still clutching her rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. When she saw him, she stood so quickly she nearly fell. He caught her arms, steadying her, and for the first time in his career, he struggled to find clinical words for what had occurred. "Sophia is stable," he began, then stopped. "How did you explain the inexplicable? The surgery was successful. We were able to remove the entire tumor." Elena collapsed against him, sobbing with relief. "I knew it," she kept repeating. "I knew Our Lady would save her. I knew it." Marcus held the crying woman, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Mrs. Martinez, something happened in there. I don't know how to explain it, but I think your prayers were heard." Over the following days, Sophia's recovery defied all medical expectations. She was awake within hours, talking within a day, walking within 3. The pathology report on the tumor showed it had been malignant and aggressive, the kind that typically prove fatal even with treatment. But follow-up scans showed no trace of cancer anywhere in her body. It was as if it had never existed. Word of what happened spread to the hospital like wildfire. Staff members who hadn't been in the OR that night were skeptical, but those who had been there never forgot what they witnessed. Some returned to long-abandoned faith. Others simply accepted that there were things beyond human understanding. The hospital security footage from that night mysteriously corrupted, showing only static during the crucial minutes, though the equipment had been functioning perfectly before and after. Marcus found himself sitting in the hospital chapel for the first time in his career. He didn't pray, didn't even know how to anymore, but he sat in the quiet space and tried to process what happened. Patricia found him there one evening, a week after the surgery. "She's asking for you," Patricia said. "Sophia. She says she has something to tell you." In her room, Sophia was sitting up in bed, coloring in a book Elena had brought. She looked like any other 7-year-old, except for the wisdom in her eyes that seemed beyond her years. When Marcus entered, she smiled and held out a picture she'd drawn. It was crude, as children's drawings are, but unmistakable. A figure in blue robes stood beside a man in green scrubs, both watching over a small figure on a bed. Above them all, she'd drawn a heart with light radiating from it. "She told me you would save me," Sophia said simply. "The pretty lady in blue. She came to me when I was sleeping and said not to be scared because you would know what to do." Marcus took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. "When did she tell you this?" "Before the accident," Sophia replied, returning to her coloring as if she'd said nothing extraordinary. "She said I had important things to do when I grew up, and that you needed to remember something you forgot." "What did I forget?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. Sophia looked up at him with those 2 wise eyes. "That miracles happen when head knowledge meets heart faith. She said you used to know that when you were little, but you forgot when the first boy went to heaven." Marcus felt his breath catch. He never told anyone about that first patient, about how it had changed him. There was no way this child could have known. Elena reached over and squeezed his hand. "Dr. Chun, I know you don't share my faith, but I want you to know that you were the answer to my prayers. God worked through your hands that night." Marcus stayed with him a while longer, listening to Sophia chatter about her plans to become a doctor herself one day, to help children like he had helped her. As he finally prepared to leave, Elena pressed something into his hand. It was a small medal of Our Lady of Guadalupe. "I can't take this," Marcus protested. "Please," Elena insisted. "It belonged to my grandmother. She always said it would go to someone who needed to remember that heaven is closer than we think." That night, Marcus called his own mother for the first time in 5 years. They'd been estranged since his father's death, when Marcus had raged against a God who would take such a good man through cancer. His mother cried when she heard his voice, and cried harder when he told her about Sophia. "Your father always said you'd find your way back," she told him. "He said God would use you to do impossible things, but first you had to learn that the impossible exists." 6 months later, at Sophia's final checkup, she remained completely cancer-free. The case was written up in medical journals, though the supernatural elements were carefully omitted from official reports. Those who had been in the OR that night had an unspoken agreement about what they'd witnessed. Some things were too precious, too sacred to dissect with scientific scrutiny. Marcus continued his work, still the same brilliant surgeon, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer saw his skills as solely his own. When faced with impossible cases, He remembered Sophia's words about head knowledge and heart faith. His success rate, already impressive, became almost miraculous. Colleagues joked that he had a direct line to heaven, not knowing how close to the truth they might be. Sophia did grow up to become a doctor, specializing in pediatric oncology. She kept the drawing she made from Marcus framed in her office, a reminder that healing comes from sources both seen and unseen. Elena remarried a kind man who loved Sophia as his own, and they had 2 more children. She never stopped praying the rosary, and never stopped telling the story of the night her daughter was saved. Marcus retired eventually, his hands no longer steady enough for surgery. At his retirement ceremony, the hospital unveiled a new pediatric wing named in his honor. But the moment that moved him most was when Sophia, now Dr. Martinez, spoke about the surgeon who had saved her life and, in her words, proved that miracles still happen in modern medicine. Standing in that crowded auditorium, surrounded by colleagues and former patients, Marcus felt the weight of the medal Elena had given him all those years ago. He still carried it in his pocket during every surgery, a tangible reminder the night heaven touched earth in an operating room. He'd never fully returned to the faith of his childhood, but he'd found something perhaps more valuable, an acceptance that mystery and medicine could coexist, that sometimes the greatest act of intelligence is admitting there are things beyond human understanding. As the ceremony ended and people came to congratulate him, Marcus noticed a young resident standing apart, the same skeptical expression Marcus had once worn. He walked over to the young man, remembering himself at that age, so certain that science held all the answers. "Let me tell you something," Marcus said, placing a fatherly hand on the resident's shoulder. "In all my years of medicine, the most important thing I learned wasn't a surgical technique or a diagnostic method. It was that healing is both an art and a miracle. We provide the skill, but sometimes something greater provides a possibility." The resident looked skeptical, but interested. Marcus smiled, remembering his own journey from certainty through doubt to a faith that transcended both. "Keep your mind sharp and your skills honed," Marcus continued. "But never close your heart to the possibility that we're part of something larger than ourselves. The day you think you have all the answers is the day you stop being a true healer." Years later, that resident would become one of the country's leading surgeons, known for taking on cases others deemed hopeless. He kept a photo in his office of Dr. Marcus Chun and a young patient named Sophia Martinez, a reminder that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for someone with enough skill and faith to make it possible. The monitor that had shown the miraculous image that night was eventually decommissioned, but not before Patricia had it thoroughly examined. The technicians found nothing wrong with it, no explanation for what had occurred. It now sits in a storage room, gathering dust, an ordinary piece of equipment that once displayed something extraordinary. Sometimes new staff members ask about it, having heard whispers of the miracle of or 7. Those who were there that night just smile and say that some stories have to be lived to be believed. Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 82, his family surrounding him. In his final moments, witnesses say he smiled and reached out as if greeting someone only he could see. Elena, now a grandmother herself, insists she smelled roses in the room, despite the absence of flowers. Sophia, holding his hand as he passed, felt a familiar presence, the same one she'd sensed all those years ago when she lay dying on an operating table. At his funeral, hundreds came to pay their respects. Former patients, colleagues, students he'd mentored. But the most moving tribute came from Sophia, who read from a letter Marcus had written to be opened after his death. In it, he thanked her for reminding him that the greatest miracles often come disguised as ordinary moments, that faith and science need not be enemies but can dance together in the sacred space of healing, and that sometimes God uses our hands to write stories that defy all logic but affirm the deepest truths of the human spirit. The story of a night the Virgin Mary appeared in, or 7, became legend at St. Catherine's Hospital. New doctors and nurses hear it whispered in break rooms, told in hushed tones during night shifts. Some dismiss it as imagination, mass hysteria, or equipment malfunction. But those who have faced their own impossible cases, who have stood at the intersection of skill and despair, sometimes find themselves whispering a prayer, remembering that once, in that very hospital, Heaven made itself known through static on a monitor and guided a surgeon's hands to do the impossible. Watch the next video on your screen to witness another incredible story of divine intervention that will restore your faith in miracles.